Welcome to today's BLU meeting. We're going to have present in Inkscape with Martin Owens. Martin is a contractor who's worked on Inkscape for several years.
Excellent. Thank you, Jerry. So I am one of the core Inkscape developers. I sit on the project leadership committee for the project, and I've been working with Inkscape since probably about 2011. Our goal is to produce an accessible open source tool that basically allows non-developers to access the wonderful world of graphic design through editing SVG files. Inkscape does not merely export to SVG, it actually edits the SVG in memory, right? So our memory format is the SVG XML itself. I think this particular group would be interested to have a quick introduction to that from that facet, because I think that that's probably the most technically interesting. First of all, the Inkscape program itself is available for multiple platforms. It should be available in your distro of choice. The latest versions are available from the Inkscape website as an app image, but also as a binary, and should be available from FlatHub and probably from Snaps, probably, but definitely from Debian. We have a PPA, personal package archive for Ubuntu and Ubuntu-based derivatives. So if you want the latest version of Inkscape from the Inkscape project itself, you can subscribe your distro to the Inkscape stable PPA and get the latest version. You should have version 1.4 if you are using the latest version. The program itself is a graphical user interface program that allows you to edit graphics. So it's primarily focused around using the keyboard and mouse to be able to draw things on the screen. But there are a lot of uses for the tool because it can do a lot of things from the command line, and as well as using Python in order to run things like extensions. So if you're a programmer, you can actually get a lot out of Inkscape by worried about like trying things out, pressing different things and seeing what happens. I think one of the most useful first tools to draw with is probably the rectangle tool. This is basically a tool that you can click on, and you can click and drag on the canvas. I'll change the color to that so you can see it. And when you click and drag, you can basically create a rectangle that is entirely square with the canvas itself. This is an object which you can use the select tool to move around. Just turn that off. And one thing that I should point out straight away is that the way in which drawing is done in a vector tool is very different from the way drawing is done in a raster tool, in that each of the objects is rendered in order of how it appears in the file, right? So in this particular case, this rectangle appears last in the file. This rectangle, the blue one behind it, appears first. And Inkscape allows you to use the page up and page down keys to change the order of the objects, which basically just moves it around in the stack. To show you that this is an SVG file, I'm going to use Control-Shift-X to open up the XML editor. Normally, I wouldn't teach people about this dialog directly, but I think that this audience will appreciate that. And you can see immediately that inside the XML editor is the SVG XML. And then you can see there's a group, which is the layer that we're currently drawing in, and the 2 rectangles and 1 piece of text. And if you click on those, you can actually see the properties that are engaged in the XML itself. And if I edit in the XML editor, you can see that I can modify the contents of the canvas. So if you want to know whether something is possible in SVG, you can actually start editing and playing around with the values themselves directly. Obviously, like a normal editor, there is things like undo and redo and being able to save and export to various formats. If somebody has a specific workflow or requirement that they'd like to learn about, please let me know. I want to actually make sure I can see these comments. Yes, good. So the next tool that I usually teach is things like the star tool. Mostly I teach to kids, and kids love playing with the polygon tool because it allows them to use, to create interesting little diagrams for their posters and graphics. The polygon tool just basically allows you to create a, let's just move that away, a regular shape with a number of corners, spoke ratios, and roundedness, and so on. The one thing I will say that each of the tools has a set of preferences in the top bar. It's very important to familiarize yourself with each of the tools' preferences because that is how most of the controls work. The tools on the left-hand side of the screen change the bar at the top. And each time you select a tool, different things will be presented to you. So in this particular case, you see how I changed the regular polygon to a star or a polygon. That is a primary option for the polygon tool. The same thing for the number of spokes and all of the other various options. To give you an example of what that would look like for the text tool, if I bring in this piece of text and double click on it, which will select the text tool, you'll see it's selected here. You'll see that the text tool now has options for selecting the font, selecting the size and italices and other various things. There is actually a bunch of complex text editing tools for doing things like flowed text, text on a path so you can curve it around things, and doing various spacing and directionality. So for instance, for Arabic, Chinese, etc. But those are all complicated, like more advanced topics. So those are sort of like the building blocks that you would build a graphic up from. And then on top of that, each of the objects that you create has a fill and stroke. Now I am just sharing my screen, so I'm going to need this fill and stroke dialog to be inside of my screen. I'm currently not sharing the full window, the full display, so that popped up and it doesn't want to go back in. So apologies for not being able to show you that. I'm currently using the master version, the in development version, and I think we broke the ability to drag and drop the dialogues. Usually each of the dialogues that appear on the right-hand side, they can be dragged into a new window that pops up, or they can be dropped around. Stop sharing this window, and I'm going to share the entire screen, and I think that will help. While I'm on a little bit of a break, does anybody have any questions? Okay. Okay, so hopefully everybody can see that. So this is the fill and stroke dialog that I mentioned previously. This is a core component for how you control how the object that you've created, be it a rectangle or a piece of text or a star, is rendered by setting its fill. The fill is basically everything that is inside of the boundary for the shape. So in this case, the letter B, L, and U. We can set the color by using the color picker. This fill color doesn't have to be a flat color. It can also be a gradient, which we have various options for: linear gradients and radial gradients and so on. It can also be things like patterns, which can be complicated, and that's more of an advanced topic. And what people will do is they will select the various colors and hues for the fill, and then they'll move on to the stroke. Now, the stroke is a way of saying, I want to paint a line around the object that I have, right? And this doesn't mean just things like rectangles and stars. It also applies to things like text. By default, the stroke is off. But when you apply the stroke, you'll see that now we have a black line going around each of the letters, including the holes inside of the letters. So the entire shape itself is drawn with that line around it. And the stroke has a color, but it also has a lot of styles, because obviously you want to be able to set the width of the stroke. Make it black. I think it'd be easier to see. So if you can see, that's a 3-point stroke and a 9-point stroke. As well as that, there's also ways of controlling how the stroke behaves. So you can make the stroke pointy, or you can make it rounded at the corners or pointed, as well as changing the rendering order between the fill and the stroke itself. So you remember how I said that each of the shapes is rendered in order from top to bottom? Well, in the case of the fill and stroke, each of those things is rendered also in order. But in this case, there is a rendering order option to tell you how those things are rendered. In this particular case, I'm rendering the stroke first and then the fill on top. But if I tell it to change that and render the stroke first, the fill first and then the stroke, you can see how the stroke completely covers the fill. So this basically allows you to change the style. And in this particular case, you can see how the stroke eats into the fill, because half of the stroke is outside of the shape and half of the stroke is inside of the shape, right? So it'll increase the size of the object as well as eating into the fill. So a lot of the time for text, people will use the set stroke behind the fill, simply so because it looks better. There is one other thing that you can set to do with strokes, but it can't be applied to text. And this is a marker. So in order to talk about markers, I'm going to have to talk about the pen tool. So far, the only thing that we've created is solid shapes. But it is possible actually to use the pen tool to create arbitrary shapes by basically clicking and then moving the mouse and then clicking again, and clicking continuously until you get back to the original point. And you can see how we can make irregular shapes. And then once we have what's known as a path, we can then use the node editing tool to change the position of the shapes at any time, right? Once you have this kind of a shape, you can actually set a these lines do not have to be straight lines. They can also be curved lines defined as Beziers. And to do that, you just hover the mouse over the line itself and drag in order to change the curve of the line. And you can actually make some very complicated and beautiful shapes by just changing the way in which these curves basically join together. Once you understand how these shapes are put together, you can then change the node types. This is basically controlling how each of those lines will join together. The default is for it to be a sharp, what's known as a cusp node. If you change it to a, I should point out, a cusp node is like this sharp node here at the edge of this wave, whereas most other line joins will want to be a smooth node where the line comes in directly and meets perfectly. This is so that you get a very smooth line as it's rendered. And to do this, you just use the node tools node type selector, which is at the top here. I would recommend that if anybody wants to play with drawing arbitrary shapes, that don't worry about the formal definition for like how these nodes are put together. I would just play with the tool, click and drag and play and make mistakes, because this is really the best way to learn. And this is exactly the kind of tool that is forgiving when you do make mistakes. We know we have this program in front of kids as young as 6 and 8, and most of the time the way that we program Inkscape is to make it accessible, so that if you do make mistakes, it doesn't punish you too harshly. Okay, so what I needed to show you the pen tool in order to demonstrate is the third part of stroking, which is markers. A lot of you will be aware of what markers are, because they're basically like the arrows that you put at the ends and starts of lines. In this particular case, you can see this path. I've added a marker of an arrow. You can see that it starts and stops here. This is the last node that I edited in the path. So this is where the arrow has gone. And as I change the shape of the path, you can see the arrow changes where it points to. That's an end marker. But if I add a mid marker, I'm going to just change the ordering slightly so you can see them. So I've added a circular mid marker, and you can see everywhere that there is a point in the path, it now draws a circular point. These markers are usually not useful for artistry, but they are very useful for diagramming. And this is what I think that this audience would probably appreciate, is being able to draw things, graphs and various other things where you have a regular and set way to define things like node graphs. Maybe you want to show things on charts. This is exactly the kind of option that you will want to use. Obviously, as well as this fill and stroke order, the reason why there are 6 options here is because one of the options is where to draw the markers themselves. And then I'm going to pause for questions. Does anybody have any questions? And also, if I'm moving too fast. Wherever its location is and whatever the alignment is, it's not fixed into any paragraph or other kind of systemic system. So don't expect it to behave in a way like it might in a word processor. What we're talking about here is basically it's a piece of text that is placed on a canvas at any location, and you can just drag it around in free form. You can obviously create multiple lines. And I would recommend that when you do, make sure you pay attention to the way the font selection works, because Inkscape will be more honest about what the options are with fonts. If your font only has an italic and doesn't have a bold, Inkscape won't pretend that it has a bold. Some programs will. They'll basically, increase the width of the glyph or whatever in order to pretend that there is that option. Inkscape tends not to want to pretend about things like that. It wants to be honest. Say this font doesn't have an italic, we're not going to make it italic for you. You can do that yourself if you want. This actually brings me neatly to non-resizing controls. So do you remember before, as well as dragging things around, we could resize using the handles? Well, Inkscape actually has a second mode, and if you click on the object a second time, you'll notice that the handles will actually change. And now we have rotate and skew. These are basically the full extent to which shapes in an SVG file can be modified using a matrix transform. It's scale, translation, skew, and rotation. If you want an italic piece of text and the font doesn't support it, you can just skew it, make it look like it's supposed to be italic. Excuse me a second. Okay. So we've gone through, I think, what are most of the basics for doing diagram type files. I think one of the things we should talk about is exporting. So by default, when you save a file in Inkscape, it will be an SVG file, which makes sense because the actual file that's in memory is an SVG, and we're just writing this XML out to a text file. But you'll also want to export it to various other things. For example, you can export a diagram or a picture as a PNG. This is a rasterized version, and you should pay attention to things like the dots per inch, the resolution of the image that you export. Many people who use Inkscape accidentally export their files with a low resolution and then wonder why the file is so blurry when they open it in another program or they put it on a website. You can also export to PDF. This can be useful in order to print it or to send it to somebody that doesn't have an SVG viewer. It can also be useful to send it out to print. One thing to bear in mind is that Inkscape 1.4 and older only support red, green, blue, or RGB-based color management for PDF files and printing. So if you are coming from a more professional background where you expect vector editing to have, for instance, CMYK-based color management, these versions of Inkscape do not support that. The next version of Inkscape will, but it's not quite ready yet. That is also an advanced topic for doing color management. We also added the ability to export to various other raster images. So, for instance, JPEG and TIFF and WebP. As the developer, I can actually explain briefly about how these work. We export the PNG, and then we hand it off to Python that uses Python PIL library to convert that PNG to a JPEG or a WebP. That's basically how that works. Inkscape itself didn't really want to get its hands dirty with supporting JPEG and WebP and TIFF, but we got around that by using Python extensions. The extensions are very powerful, as you can see here. So if you want something, some raster format or some other thing for an export, and you know how to write Python, you can just see what we've written already and write your own if you want. The export dialog actually does have some advanced features, so being able to export various pages and documents. I should actually create a second page so we can actually see what that looks like. So when you have multiple pages, for example, you can export one of those pages when you're exporting to a PNG or raster, and you can export multiple pages if you're exporting to a PDF, because that's a format that supports them. So do pay attention to what is selected and the type of file that you're exporting to. There's a question. I remember GIMP doesn't do CMYK due to patent issues. How does Inkscape handle the patent complications? There are no patents for CMYK. So for device-independent CMYK management, it's a basic set of mathematics for converting between red, green, blue values and basically the ink levels. And what's important when you're doing device independent CMYK for most designers is that you can define how much black is in something. So for instance, if you are doing a piece of text, like a whole block of text, what you really want that for that text is it to be using just black ink, right? Not a mixture of magenta and cyan and yellow, but actual black. And if it's a conversion from red, green, blue, the computer doesn't know how much black to use, so it just defaults to using a mixture of inks. And device independent means that you don't really care about like how black it looks because it's not precisely color calibrated. It's just informing the printer that for this image or for this piece of this object inside the image, this piece of text will just be using black ink, and then this piece of black that's actually a part of a logo or something will actually be using a mixture of magenta and black together. That control can be very important for some design applications. Once you have a device independent CMYK graphic, you can then use ICC profiles, which are a type of color management converter file that can basically make sure that the way in which it looks on your screen is how it will actually print out. There's an entire color management workflow that you have to enable. The best tool to look at on Linux for doing color management stuff is actually Critter. The Critter project have put a lot of work into not only developing some pretty solid color management workflows inside their software, but also they have some of the best documentation for explaining how color management works and why and when you need to use it. For Inkscape, because we're doing vectors, you'll notice that in the XML, when you have a say, for instance, this rectangle, and you have a style, just like you might in HTML, you'll notice that the fill is then defined by a hex value that starts with a hash and then has 6 hex digits, 2 for red, 2 for green, 2 for blue. This is a standard HTML web format. If you are paying attention to the HTML and CSS developments, I think it's CSS color modes 4, 5, and 6. You'll notice that device CMYK is now one of those options, right? So you can actually define in your HTML pages and also in your SVG files in Inkscape, in the next version of Inkscape, you'll actually be able to define those ink values as well. And so a lot of this color support is actually coming from the development of web standards themselves, and none of those are patent encumbered, fortunately. The only time that patents and copyrights come up when it comes to color management stuff is either the ICC profiles themselves. Some of them are not open and free to distribute. That is mostly a copyright issue. libcms2, am I getting that right? libcms, yeah, is the library that does color conversions and is actually one of the world's best color management libraries. So Linux is actually doing really well for having like the standard way in which you can do color conversions. But you do need access to those ICC profiles to be able to do that properly. So one of the things that people get confused at is Pantone colors. Pantone is it's copyright and trademark. Yeah, I'm fairly certain that's right. I don't think there's any patent incumbent in that specifically, but it's a very complicated and murky field. The idea is that in order to define a color by its Pantone name, you have to subscribe and license the palette of colors from the Pantone company. Their argument is that they get physical inks and they measure them with spectrometry in order to figure out what their characteristics are when they mix, and therefore all of that work that they do on how physical inks will operate on paper should be paid for. And so they do want licensing. In fact, so much so that Adobe products recently rescinded access to the Pantone color set by default because they didn't really have a licensing agreement with Pantone anymore. And so artists and designers were encouraged to buy Pantone color palettes directly, basically to buy their own license. It basically put Adobe in exactly the same position that any open source project would be, that if you wanted to use Inkscape with the Pantone color set, you have to license it from Pantone directly.
Flip side
Right?
is that the Pantone color set is only useful if you're going to pay a human printer to source and load specific Pantone color inks onto a press instead of standard CMYK 4-color, which is what your inkjet or laser or the most inexpensive color printing options in the world are. So unless your trademark needs a specific Pantone color for the logo, well, you'll specify that Pantone color when you order letterhead, and then you don't have to print it with your inkjet printer. But for most of us, not having access to Pantone probably shouldn't be an issue. We should probably be sticking with the CMYK colors for printing and RGB colors for the monitor anyway.
Yeah, so you don't need Pantone colors if, for example, you're eyeballing the color on your screen and your screen is calibrated, which most people's screens are not. But let's assume that you have a color hug device, you've put it up to your screen, you've calibrated your screen, you have an ICC profile that you have generated. There are some really good Linux tools for developing, for making an ICC profile from your monitor. And you eyeball a color using the color picker, and then you send that to a printer, and you want that color to print out exactly the same as it appeared on your screen. I mean, obviously, there's going to be a slight difference. There's gamut corrections and obviously white point because it's a bright source versus a reflective source. But you should be able to approximate an accurate rendering if you are using the correct workflow without Pantone. But what Pantone allows you to do is it allows you to have, even if you're doing color mixing, even if you're not using a direct ink yourself. So for instance, for the logos and things, they will have a very specific Pantone color that they then use a very specific ink for. But it's also used by people that want to be able to mix CMYK together in the correct proportions, because your color mixing printer might actually have a color corrector profile for named Pantone colors, right? So essentially, it's recorrecting or recalibrating itself based upon what you have said, not based upon the CMYK values that you've put into the PDF file, but the name of the Pantone, and they can then just recalibrate the printer against that name, and that's also what it's being used for. It's basically using Pantone as a cheap and nasty ICC profile. But if you're doing the correct workflow, you don't need to do that, I don't think. Okay, so that's a bit of weeds for CMYK color management stuff. I could talk forever because it's actually what I've been doing this past year on Inkscape is developing the color model and expanding Inkscape's functionality. One of the complaints that we've had. Sorry.
I was just saying, it sounds like things have changed a lot since I heard that about GIMP, which was many years ago.
Oh yeah, it's very confusing because there's lots of different components and pieces and companies involved, and they all say things about like, well, if you pay yours, everything will be okay. So yeah, one of the complaints for designers adopting the Linux desktop has traditionally been that they don't have access to all of the tools necessary to do their work. And for vector editors, there really hasn't been an effective editor that could do print-ready stuff. You could use Scribus to do conversions, but it didn't support enough of the SVG spec to make that worthwhile. But it does do a lot of PDF management workflows that are very effective for document preparedness, but it doesn't matter if you're a designer that's doing logos and your logo doesn't translate, your SVG logo doesn't translate into Scribus for it to be able to be converted into CMYK colors. So the work that I've been doing this past year to enable that is really about enabling more designers and people who are currently not able to use a Linux desktop to be able to use it, right? Because Adobe have refused to support Linux for their products. But that's okay. It just means that Inkscape doesn't have a competitor. But it does mean that we do have to support these things because not supporting them really does hurt the ability for a large group of people to be able to adopt this platform.
Yeah, one more question. What exactly is Scribus? Because I know of a program with Scribus on Linux, but it's an EPUB ebook editor. So I'm sure that's not what you're talking about.
No. So Scribus is what's known as a desktop publisher. If you remember the Microsoft Publisher days, it's kind of along those lines. It would be the equivalent of Adobe InDesign. And its focus is on text layout. It's what you might use if you wanted to print out a magazine or a newspaper. So like say if you were doing your own news sheets and printing them out for your neighborhood or something, Scribus is a pretty solid tool for that once you get around its user experience. It's a very complicated tool because it's been developed to solve a very specific problem, and it's not really been developed with users in mind, or I should say with new users in mind. Like once you know how to use the tool, it's very powerful, but it's one of those Linux programs that does demand a lot of you. But that's kind of the problem, is that people use use Inkscape because it's easier, right? You can put together your fact sheets and your logos and your raster images and various other things together, and then export them to a PDF and then print them out. But if you then suddenly start needing to do something a bit more professional, Inkscape will start getting in your way because it's no longer helping you do the print management stuff. And then Scribus is not helping you either because it's not supporting the SVG spec fully. So you're not getting the best kind of workflow, even if you were to combine the tools. I'm sorry if that doesn't explain what a desktop publishing app is.
I'm familiar with that stuff.
Okay. Yeah, Scribus has for been a long time has been a sort of sister project in the Libre graphics community, along with GIMP and Critter and Blender and everything else. If you have both Inkscape and Scribus installed at the same time in Inkscape 1.4 and 1.3, you can actually export to Scribus PDF, and we will call Scribus from the command line to construct as near best as they can support with SVG to be able to export your SVG as a CMYK PDF with all of the limitations that implies. Okay. So I did exports. There are a bunch of different formats. One useful thing that you can do is batch exporting if you want to export a bunch of different things and they're all from the same document. You can use the batch exporter. It's a fairly complicated tool, but it's pretty direct. Select the kinds of things that you want to batch export, select which of the things you want to export, and then set the types. And set the directory that you want all of these files to be created in. This is a useful way of basically, say, if you have a document with a bunch of icons in it and you want to export them all as the same format, you can do it through this. It doesn't have to be PNGs. You can actually export it to another SVG. So if you wanted to split out your SVG into a bunch of other SVGs, this is a useful way to do that. That should cover, I think, most of editing. And I've been talking for about 30 minutes. So I'm going to actually throw it open to questions if that's okay.
Actually, I did have another question I put in the chat earlier about the when you were showing the SKU. Because up in GIMP, there's also something called a perspective tool, where you can take a rectangle and make it like non-rectangular, like a I feel like was it called frustum or something? So
Yes.
it's like one size larger and the smaller.
Yeah. So SVG by itself doesn't support perspective skew of any kind, right? Because it only has access to a matrix transform. But Inkscape has some extra tools called live path effects, which are available in path effects. And these tools allow you to essentially extend what SVG can do. And what we do internally is we convert the object into a path and then run code against that path, generate a new path from that, and then save that path into the SVG. And then we pretend that those two objects that we've created are the same thing, in order for you to be able to edit it on the canvas. And one of those tools is the perspective tool. And you'll notice the first thing that it asks you to do is that text objects are not supported by live path effects. We have to convert the text to a path, which means that we can't edit the text as text anymore. It's now a shape, which is unfortunate. But once it is a path, we can then use many of these tools, including the envelope deformation and perspective envelope. And I wouldn't say that the user interface is particularly good for these, but you can still get the kinds of results that you need. And designers are working on improving the user interface constantly, because these are all pretty new.
Oh yeah.
There are obviously limitations because it's no longer a piece of text. One of the interesting things about Inkscape is that it's one of the few proprietary or open source tools that is dedicated to its open format. So GIMP has its own format that you can save to. Critter has CRA files, Blender has blend files, but Inkscape doesn't have an Inkscape file. It has SVGs. And that is a very unique situation, but it also means that we have to be very inventive about how we can make new functionality for the tool without breaking the standard that we've said that we're going to abide by. We actually send somebody to the World Wide Web Consortium that look after the SVG spec in order to negotiate what the next version of SVG will look like, because it's important for us to be able to get some of the functionality that we need into the spec. So there are things like the mesh gradient tool that was added in, oh, that looks awful, that was added into SVG2, which if you save this SVG and then try to open it in a browser, this would be not filled correctly. But that's because Inkscape supports SVG2, and most web browsers haven't caught up yet, but hopefully they will.
Yeah, it looks pretty impressive.
Okay. If there's no questions, does anybody have anything that they'd like to be demonstrated?
I have a question. I may have missed the answer just a few minutes ago, but when you convert a bit of text into a path so that you can manipulate how it's drawn, when you save that to SVG, does it have like extra metadata that other SVG parsers might ignore, and that metadata would say how to turn it back into a text?
Kinda.
Or is it one way? You turn it into a path and it's never going to be text again?
It's mostly one way. So if you open up the XML editor and you can see this group of objects, it still has the ID text4. So it's kept the same ID. And you'll notice that inside there is an attribute that says ARIA label. And you can see that the text that was in the original object is here. So this is for accessibility. So if you were to save this SVG and then open it in a web browser, somebody who is blind will still be able to see that, hopefully, I think. if the ARIA label works correctly. And inside the style, the font size, line height, and font family, all of those things are still there. So you could theoretically reconstruct what the text looked like, but there's a bunch of other things that are not here. For instance, the position of the first glyph and the any kerning information. So any if you put in special gaps between things, that would be lost. So it's like we try and preserve as much information as we can, but this is a fairly one-way process.
Okay, thanks. I was just curious.
Yeah, it's one of those things that, like, I wish the SVG spec allowed us to do things to text glyphs as if they were paths, because it would open the avenue up to like doing a lot of interesting things that a lot of people want to be able to do for graphics. Okay. Yep. So I'm just making some text. So what I'm going to show you is flowing text, because I don't think I showed text being flowed into anything yet. If you have some text and then you have a shape, let's say this square, and you select both of them, you can actually use the text flow into frame, except the box is on top, to flow the text inside of the frame. And then as you type some more text, you can see it wraps around inside of the frame. There is actually padding that you can change on the canvas. And there is more interesting and complicated things, for instance, being able to exclude, I don't want a pie chart, exclude objects from the text. Select the text, set subtraction frames. And now you can see this shape is now excluded from the text. This is the kind of thing that you could do for doing layouts. This is more of a desktop publishing piece of functionality. And the existence of these things in SVG highly suggests that we should be doing more desktop publishing functionality in the future. But the functionality is still, I think, needs more work.
Can you set up to train it to multiple boxes? So if there's too much text for one box, it'll flow into the next box, which might be on a different page. It might be different columns on the same page.
Yes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to unflow this. I'm going to create two boxes. Right. So if you have two columns, if I keep them as two separate boxes, and then I select both of them at the same time and do the same thing, text flow into frame. I don't have enough text, so this doesn't work. Ooh, oh, right, because it's below it. This text, so the order of the painting still matters. So you can see here this text flows from here to here, but within these two objects. And in fact, if I move the object under it, you can see the text actually moves with it, right? Mm-hmm. Now, if I undo that and I do text unflow, and what I'm going to do is, instead of these being two objects, I'm going to combine them into one using the path tools union, which basically turns these two rectangles into two sub paths of the same shape. They're basically the same shape. They're just, you know, you can see them overlapping, right? If I use this object and I flow into this, you'll see how the text now doesn't flow to the bottom and then to the next shape. It flows straight across, right? So it's flowing from this thing into this thing based upon its position, right? So you get a very different result depending upon whether you're flowing into two separate shapes or flowing into one shape that has multiple areas. And I don't know if I explained paths well enough to have jumped subpaths on you.
I I understood from GIMP that they were thinking about putting text along a path, like you have a curved path and it'll like curve the text along the path.
Yes.
Is that one of the things?
Yeah. So if you have a path, let's just make this a line. So a shape doesn't have to be a whole shape. It can just be a line. Make this fat enough so you can see. So it can be a line like this. And then if I have a piece of text, let's use this one. And then I select both of the shapes and I put text, put on path. You'll now see that the text flows with the path itself. The next version of Inkscape will have a little bit more control over setting the gap between the line and the text, as well as its position along this line. But for now, you can see that it flows. Now, what you'll notice is that the actual shapes of the glyph are not changing. The glyph positions and rotations are just being modified, right? So sometimes people will create very sharp circular objects, and the shape and the letters will essentially bump into each other because the shape of the glyphs is not being modified. It's just the positions. And people have requested the ability to be able to flow onto a line, but also like modify how the glyphs flow. For now, the best thing that you can do is to put it onto the line as you need it, and then convert that to a path which disassociates it, so it's no longer on the line, and then use the live path effects as we did before to then shape it a bit better to fit if it's a logo, for example. One tip I will point out is that to quickly fill and stroke things, I'm using the palette at the bottom of the screen. Palettes can be selected with this tool on the right. Once you have a palette selected, any object that you have selected on the canvas, you can press the mouse button on it to create a fill, or you can hold the shift key and press to set the stroke color in this case. And there's a couple of other tools for opacity and setting whether it's locked or visible. So I don't think I mentioned much about the Pages tool. The Pages tool is fairly new. SVG doesn't support multiple pages, so I added Pages as a extra piece of functionality, a bit like the live path effects. It's mostly useful for exporting. But the Pages tool has some basic word processing, but not a lot. Don't expect it to do paragraphs or anything like that. But you can set the styles and the sizes and margins. Okay. Does that about cover everything? didn't import any raster images, so I will just do that. This object isn't actually a vector. It originally was, but it's now a raster. It's basically it's a PNG that's inside this SVG. It will support PNGs, JPEGs, but not WebP, and it will support TIFFs. It's basically whatever your GNOME graphics library will support. Raster images obviously will get blurry when you zoom in, unlike a vector, which will infinitely re-render. But sometimes you'll need photographs and various other things inside of your diagrams, and you can do that by using the file import to import your JPEGs. You can also drag and drop them. It's covering a little more word processing because I originally focused a little bit on the diagramming. Okay, so if nobody has any questions, we can end it there.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you,
Excellent.
Martin.
Yeah,
Thank you
thanks, Mark.
for having me.